Good morning. It certainly is good to see everyone here this morning. I want to start by giving a quick shout out to Mr. Mark for their hospitality to my wife and myself and to some of the other young families that last night they had to get together. And I appreciate him so much for being diligent and searching for my car key that I lost last night already. We were in and out of camp chairs and stuff, and I guess it just slipped off my key ring, and we got back last night. Luckily, Kaylin had her car key, and I guess there's a lesson in that, showing to be prepared. But I called Brother Jonathan, and I said, I don't have my car key. Can you call Mark and see if it's at his house? And so thankfully he found it, and I appreciate him so very much. And I appreciate you all so very much for being here this morning. You know, this book right here, this is a New Testament. And this is something that I like to keep on me usually at all times. Whenever I'm preaching, I will generally take one into the pulpit with me. Whenever I'm teaching a class, I will keep one in the pulpit with me. Whenever I attended the Memphis School of Preaching, we would go on various door-knocking campaigns, and I would always slip one in my back pocket. I keep one in my car. I keep one in Kaylin's car, and it's just something very handy to have on you almost at all times. But when you think about a New Testament, what generally is attached to the back of a New Testament? Does anybody know? What's the one book that's usually attached to every New Testament? The book of Psalms. And if you're lucky enough, maybe you'll find one that has the book of Proverbs on it as well. But usually, it's the book of Psalms. You ever wondered why? Why the book of Psalms? Why not the book of 2 Kings or the book of 2 Chronicles or the book of Malachi? Why the book of Psalms? And I think that you could find the answer if you really study within the entire book of Psalms, because I think if you dive deep down into the text, you can see all of the practical life lessons that the book of Psalms has to offer. It is information that we can use in our daily lives to help us live the lives that God would have us to live on this earth. It's used to provide the encouragement and the strength to those who need it. And you think about a funeral or perhaps a graveside service. When usually the book of Psalms is opened, what is the one psalm that is usually read at those times? The 23rd Psalm. Usually people will call that the most famous psalm of the book of Psalms, and that is the chapter that's going to capture our attention this morning. So if you have your Bibles, I encourage you to go ahead and open them there to Psalm chapter 23. It is probably the most famous psalm out of the entire book of Psalms. You think about young children, oftentimes they memorize it in Bible class. You think about older folks, sometimes they'll have it read to them before they pass on from this life. Many people will call it the Pearl of the Psalms, or perhaps the Psalm of Psalms. And there are many different analogies, many different metaphors that are used throughout the Old Testament, but I don't believe that there was one that is more tender or one that is more affectionate than that of a shepherd and the sheep that he cares for. David, the author of this psalm, he wrote about the Lord being his shepherd because he knew just exactly what it meant. He knew just exactly what it took in order to be a shepherd, because he was the one who looked after his family's sheep, wasn't he? In 1 Samuel chapter 17, David was giving King Saul all of these different reasons as to why he could be the one to go out and to fight the giant Goliath, that giant Philistine. And he tells Saul, he says, there was that time when that bear came and took a sheep, and there was that time that a lion came and took the sheep, and what did he do? Well, he went out after it, and he slew the bear, he slew the lion, and he rescued that sheep, and he brought it back. And in verse 36, he tells King Saul, he says, your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing as he has defied the armies of the living God. And so David was a shepherd of sheep, but eventually he would become shepherd over the entire land of Israel, showing us that he would be king over Israel. And all of the inhabitants of that nation would become like his sheep, and he would care for them as if they were his own. But one of the things I find very interesting about this psalm is the intimate language that is used. And just the first, there are only 6 verses in this chapter, and in those 6 verses, 17 different times, and this is going through the New King James and the King James as well, 17 different times there is a personal pronoun that is used. Thus, the psalm was often referred to as the he, me psalm, because you see personal pronouns like I and me and my filled throughout this psalm. What I did was, and I want you to do this morning, I want you to make this psalm as personal to you as you can. And I know that you all have probably heard many lessons over Psalm 23, but I want you to make this as personal to yourself as you can. So what I want you to do is, as we go through this psalm this morning, for every personal pronoun that you see there, I want you to replace it with your name. And so what I did when I first started reading this psalm was I would say that the Lord is Caleb's shepherd. Caleb shall not want. And so as we go through this, I want you to do the same with your name. I want you to make it as personal as you can, and maybe this psalm will hit home just a little bit harder as we go through our study this evening. And so I encourage you to make sure your Bible is open to Psalm 23 here as we begin. And what I want us to do for the remainder of our time this morning is I want us to draw just three different lessons from this psalm. And the first one is this: in God's fold, there is provision. In God's fold, there is provision. Read with me here, beginning in verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. You know, a shepherd is going to provide for his sheep. And you might ask, well, why? And I think simply we could put it because he purchased those sheep. Today, if there was a shepherd to go out and he was to buy a flock of ewes or a flock of lambs, they would cost anywhere between $180 and $230. And so maybe we think, well, that's not a whole lot of money in today's standards, but it is still something that the shepherd purchased with his own money, with his own hard-earned money. And because a shepherd has purchased those sheep, he's going to care for them as if they are his own. Now, when the shepherd will buy those sheep, he takes a knife and he will take the ear of that sheep and he will make a little mark, a little trademark, I guess you could say, in the ear of that sheep. And it goes to show all the other shepherds that those sheep belong to that shepherd. And so perhaps if the sheep gets lost or something and someone else finds it, they can look on that ear and they can say, well, this sheep belongs to that shepherd down there, or he belongs to that shepherd over there. And that's why they do that. You know, I think back in the Old Testament, whenever there was a slave that willingly chose to serve a Hebrew family, whenever he would pledge his life to service to that Hebrew family, there was a certain ritual that would take place. Does anybody know what that certain ritual was? Yeah, exactly. They would take the ear of that slave, they would put it up against a doorpost, and they would take an awl or a small pointed tool, and they would puncture a hole in that earlobe. So in a sense, they would pierce the ear of that slave. And thus the song that we sometimes sing at a lot of youth gatherings, the song "Pierce My Ear." And the message behind that song is that we willingly pledge our lives in service to our God. And so just like the willing Hebrew slave willingly has his ear pierced by his master, we too as Christians willingly have, in a sense, our ears pierced by our God. And so the piercing of that ear signifies the slave's own choice in serving that family. And so there was that mark on that ear of the sheep that bore the mark of his shepherd. And so likewise, we too as Christians, I think there's a lesson in this for us, that we as Christians, we bear the mark of our master too, don't we? We bear the mark of Christ. You know, we are Christians, and like I mentioned a second ago, we bear the mark of Christ, but we do so through the way that we live our lives. You know, it's a tragic truth that there are those who are living a life of the world. There are those who live a life that they've willingly chosen to live, and yet they still go out and they claim that the Lord is their shepherd. They hope that just maybe by merely stating the fact that he is their shepherd, that they can enjoy all the benefits and all the blessings that the Lord has to offer without having to pay the price of leaving the world behind. But what's even more sad is that there are people who are within the Lord's church. There are those who are members of the body of Christ, children of God, and yet they don't live their lives like they should. They haven't dedicated their lives to God, and though they claim that their ear has been pierced by the Lord, in all reality, their ear has been pierced by the world. So ask yourself this morning, remember I told you I want you to make this as personal as you can. Ask yourself this morning, is the Lord truly my shepherd? Do I really belong to the Lord? Does he recognize me as one of his sheep? Am I bearing the mark of my shepherd this morning? You know, if the Lord our God is compared to a shepherd, that means that we in turn must be compared to sheep. And so maybe not the most flattering analogy ever given. I found a quote on the internet about sheep, and it was given by a shepherd, and I thought it was interesting. I wanted to share it with you all this morning. The quote says this. It says, "Goats may be obnoxious, but at least goats are smart. Sheep are, beyond question, the most ignorant animals on the face of the earth. They are dumb and they are dirty. They are timid and defenseless and helpless. Mine were always getting lost and hurt and snake-bitten, and they literally do not know enough to come out of the rain. Sheep are miserable creatures." And so this may not be the most appealing thing to which you have ever been compared to, but don't look at it in a negative way. Look at it with the vision that you and I need help, that it shows that we need to rely on something greater than ourselves. And who is it that we rely on? Well, it's our shepherd, isn't it? Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and he is there to provide for us. As we go through this psalm, we see another phrase, and it's the phrase, "I shall not want." Now, this phrase, I shall not want, doesn't mean that we're going to receive everything in life that we ever wished to receive. It doesn't mean that if a good brother gets up to pray this morning and he prays for the biggest house and the most money, the fastest car, that whenever he gets home, all of those things are just going to be waiting on him when he gets there. That's not what this is talking about. Rather, it shows us that God is going to be there to take care of us, to provide for us when we are in need. It means that God is going to get us through whatever difficult situations in which we find ourselves. You know, the shepherd is going to provide for his sheep's every need. His sheep are not going to lack anything that the shepherd knows that they need. You know, it's interesting, though, because David is the one who's writing about this idea of not being in want. They're not, rather, because David knew exactly what it meant. Because even though he was a king, even though he was a wealthy king at that, he still knew what trials and hardships were like, because he was at the point where even his own son Absalom was seeking him out and trying to kill him and trying to slay him. David knew just exactly what strife and anguish were like, yet he still knew that there was never going to be anything in life that he ever lacked if he served God. You know, there may be those in this life who are extremely wealthy. There may be those in life who seem amazingly smart on the outside and they seem so happy with their success, but on the inside, truly, they have no peace. They are unhappy on the inside. But then on the contrast, you might look at those who maybe it looks like they struggle with things. Maybe they struggle financially or in other ways physically, but because they belong to Christ, because they can call the Lord their shepherd, they're not really lacking anything. And they can have that peace within themselves because they know that the Lord is their shepherd, that he's going to provide for them, and they're going to get through whatever situations they find themselves in. If we give our lives to the shepherd, he is going to supply all of our needs. You know, I think about over in the Bible lands, and usually when I think about Bible lands, I think about dry and dusty and dirty lands. I don't think about lush green grass. I don't think about all of these, trees and grass and all those things everywhere. But what does a herd of shepherd need? Well, a herd of shepherd, or rather the flock of sheep, I guess you could say, the sheep, they need that lush green grass. And one of the interesting things about sheep is that if they're not going to lie down, they're not going to be able to be calm, they're not going to be able to lie down and have that peace and that rest about them unless 4 different requirements are met. Now, some of this research that I'm giving you this morning is from a book entitled A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. I think you can get that book on Amazon for like $5. Mr. Philip Keller is the one who wrote that book. It's a very good book if you want to read it, but he is a shepherd, and he basically goes through this psalm and kind of correlates everything to how he did as a shepherd. But one of the things that he said was this: 4 different requirements must be met in order for a sheep to lie down and to be at peace. That first requirement is this: they must be free from all fear. Sheep must be free from all fear if they're going to lie down and be at rest. Mr. Keller said in his book that sheep are extremely timid animals, and that even small creatures like mice or rabbits can startle them, and then whenever one sheep becomes startled and he begins to run all around, and the rest of the flock, they also begin to run around. And they don't know why they're running or from what they're running or even to where they're running, but they just know because one started running, they've all got to run too. And really the only thing that's going to keep the sheep calm at night or at day is if that shepherd is in their eyesight. Seeing their shepherd reassures them that they are being protected, that they're being watched over, that they don't need to worry about anything. And I think we can compare this to us as Christians today. You know, there's nothing like knowing that God is watching over you. There is nothing like knowing that God is taking care of you. There is nothing like knowing and being able to say that the Lord is my shepherd. You know, we live in a time of uncertainty. In other words, we really don't know what the day may bring. We don't know what life might throw at us. But what a blessing it is to know that even amidst all of the changing waves and seasons of life, that the Lord our shepherd is constant and he is going to be there for us. Proverbs 15 and verse 3. What a blessing it is to know that we are being cared for, that we are being watched over by our shepherd, and that we don't have to live our lives in fear. Number 2, in order for sheep to lay down and to be at rest, they must also be free from all friction. Just like most groups of animals, there is an established order of dominance among them. And Mr. Keller would talk about how within the flocks of sheep, there was always seemed to be one dominant sheep, and that he would, in a sense, go around and bully and be mean to all of the other sheep. And the sheep would be restless. It would lead to a lack of sleep. It would lead then to a lack of wanting to eat. And the sheep would just become very restless and very unhappy. When Mr. Keller would talk about how whenever the shepherd would go into their midst, it was like they immediately forgot about all of their friction. All of the problems that they had within one another, it went away because they became immediately focused on their shepherd. I'm reminded of a couple of verses here when thinking about this. I think about what Paul said in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 12. When he said, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer in need. Paul knew exactly what it meant, and he knew exactly how to be content in whatever state that he was. It didn't matter to him what his social status was among men. It didn't matter what people thought of him. It didn't matter his possessions or the things that he had in this life, which is why he was able to say in the very next verse, in verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This verse is not written, Philippians 4 and verse 13, it's not written so a football team can just quote it before they go run out onto a field. It's not written so that you can say it in your head before you go into school and take a test. This verse was written by the Apostle Paul, who was saying that he knew he could count on Christ, that he knew he could accomplish his goals through Christ, and it didn't matter what was going on around him. He didn't write these verses so he could go win a football game or ace a test at school. He wrote this verse because of the things that he said in verse 12. That in whatever situation he found himself in, if he was shipwrecked, if he was imprisoned, if he was beaten, it didn't matter what it was, he could do what he needed to do, and he could accomplish what he needed to accomplish because Christ was with him. So let's make sure that we are very careful about how we use Scripture and how we keep things in their context and make sure that we know exactly what the writer there is trying to teach us. I also think about what Jesus said here in Luke chapter 14. In Luke chapter 14, he was talking about the wedding feast, and there were those who came in. They immediately took that prime seat in front of everyone. They wanted to be seen by all men, and then what happens? They are moved to that lower seat. And so the point that Jesus is making there in Luke chapter 14 was that we need to be a humble people. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more this morning in our sermon. But we don't need to try to be better than everybody else. So many people, it seems that they just want to try to get ahead of the crowd. That they just want to try to be better than everybody else, to have their name known among all men. But rather, we need to make sure that our eyes are focused on our shepherd and that we don't worry about all the things that are happening on around us. We don't worry about those around us. Number 3, the third requirement that must be met is this. They must be free from all pests. They must be free from all pests. Now, my mom would say that she's free from all pests now that I'm out of the house, but I don't know about that. Yeah, but you know, whenever sheep are tormented by the bugs or by insects and different things that are harmful to them, it's almost impossible for them to eat. It's almost impossible for them to be at rest or to be at peace at all. But when the shepherd is there to help them, when the shepherd is there to care for them, they are able to be at peace and they are able to be at rest. As Christians, you know, there are times when things are happening that we just don't like. As Christians, there are times in our lives where things are happening and we just wish that they would change. We just wish that they would go away. You know, sometimes we allow ourselves to be so consumed by our problems. We allow ourselves to be so consumed by the world and by all the things that the world throws at us. But brothers and sisters, we must focus our lives on our shepherd, because when we go to him for help, he's willing to help us. He's willing to reach out to us, but we must be willing to look to him for that help. Number 4, the fourth requirement that must be met is this. They must be free from all hunger. They must be free from all hunger. Like we said a moment ago, you know, many of the countries, well, a lot of the countries in which sheep live, they're very dry. A lot of them are waterless. A lot of them don't have a lot of nutrition for that sheep. But, you know, green pastures for the sheep, they don't just come by chance. A shepherd must put in a lot of work into preparing those pastures for his flock in order to ensure that his sheep don't go hungry. And so I think about us as Christians and as brothers and sisters, we must feed on the Word of God. I think about Matthew 5 and verse 6, where we must hunger and thirst for it. We must be diving into the Bible. We must be gleaning all that we can and applying those things that we learn, applying them to our lives. You know, it's truly amazing how a shepherd plays a significant role in the well-being of his sheep. The sheep's well-being depends upon the diligence of the shepherd. And if the sheep have a loving shepherd, if they have a diligent shepherd, then the sheep are going to, in a sense, be able to lie down in green pastures, as we see here in Psalm 23. We don't have to fear anything. We too can comfortably lie down in green pastures because we know that our shepherd is watching over us. You know, what are some of the basic needs for, I guess, any human or any animal? What are the two things that they need? Well, they need food and they need water. And so in this case, in the sheep's case, they need that grass to eat and they need the water to drink. They need to have that strength to move and to live. But just because they can live in areas where it's hot and a lot of times where it's dry, that doesn't mean that they don't need the water or the food. Mr. Keller said this. He said, when sheep become thirsty, they become restless. They set out in search of water, and if not led to the good water supplies of clean, pure water, they will often end up drinking from polluted water holes where they pick up internal parasites and other disease germs. Going back to the verse I referenced a moment ago, Matthew 5 and verse 6, Jesus is there at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. He's in the middle of what we call today as the Beatitudes. And he says, blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Just as sheep thirst for that pure and that clean water, you and I as Christians, we must thirst for that pure, that clean, that unadulterated Word of God. We must not go off looking out around at other things and end up drinking out of polluted water holes, and we end up bringing in pagan and idolatrous practices. A good shepherd is going to lead his sheep by the still waters, and likewise, Christ does the same for us. Christ alone knows where those clean and those pure and those quiet waters are. He knows where we must go. He knows that we must go to his word, but we must be willing to follow his lead. Another phrase we see here within the psalm, there in verse 3, he restores my soul. When studying this psalm, we have to keep in mind who the one is talking, who is the one who is talking. Now, it is not the sheep, but rather it is the shepherd here. One might assume that when he or she is in care of that shepherd, that they would never get to the point to where they're going to be in need of anything, to where their souls are going to need it to be restored. But David knew that this wasn't the case. David knew just exactly what it meant to feel cast down. David knew what it meant to feel dejected. David knew what it meant to feel the trials and the hardships and all of the temptations in life. The term a cast down sheep, it's really an older English term. It's a term that you really don't hear much anymore. But it refers to a sheep that is rolled over on its back. And once a sheep is rolled over on its back, it cannot get back up on its own. It must have the help of his shepherd. Mr. Keller had this to say. He said, a cast sheep is a very pathetic sight. He said, lying on its back, its feet in the air, it flays away frantically, struggling to stand up, but without success. Sometimes it will bleat a little bit for help, but generally it lies there lashing about in a frightened frustration. And if the shepherd is not there, if he doesn't arrive on the scene within a few minutes, that sheep will die because it will not be able to get back over. And he goes into more detail, and you can read about that in his book. But a cast sheep, it's a very scary sight for his shepherd, because he has purchased that sheep and he has reared that sheep and he loves that sheep as if it were his own. There are those who believe that when a child of God fails, when a child of God falls, when a child of God sins, that God becomes hateful and furious towards that person. Now, while God does hate the sin, while God does hate the actions that the person has done, God doesn't hate the person himself. And if we are willing to confess our sins before God, he's going to forgive us. 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9. God is going to restore our souls if we ask him to. Jesus Christ, he is our good shepherd, and he always provides for his sheep. Number two, the second thing I want to point out this morning is this. In God's fold, there is guidance. In God's fold, there is guidance. Look at verses 3 and 4. We'll read verse 3 again, and then also look at verse 4. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I think about this phrase, that he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. A common misconception about sheep is that they can just live and they can graze and they can be fine wherever they are. But sheep, if they aren't taken care of, they can ruin all of the pastures that they decide to trot on. Keller talked about how ruined and how dirty the land can get if the shepherd doesn't continually move their sheep from pasture to pasture. He said the greatest single safeguard which a shepherd has in handling his flock is to keep them on the move. That is to say, they dare not be left on the same ground too long. They must be shifted from pasture to pasture periodically. And he also talked about how there was no other single aspect of the ranch operations that was more important than making sure the sheep are moving from place to place. The similarities between a sheep's behavior and a human's behavior is so similar, it's almost quite embarrassing when you look at it. We are stiff-necked and stubborn people, just like sheep are. Isaiah 53 and verse 6, Isaiah writing about Jesus Christ there, but he says this, he says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him, talking about Christ, the iniquity of us all. We habitually and we blindly follow one another regardless of what each other are doing. We turn our own way regardless of what we know that we need to be doing. We want to make things go our way. We want to do what makes us happy. But then I think about Proverbs 14 and verse 12 and chapter 16 and verse 25, where the writer there says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is what? It's death. We try to do things our own way. We try to follow our own way, even though we know in John 14 and verse 6 that Jesus says he is the way. I think about Matthew 16 and verse 24, where it says, if any man will come after me, let him do what? Deny himself, take up his cross, and follow after me. But many don't want to do this. Many don't want to deny themselves. Many don't want to give up the right of making their own decisions and doing what they want and living a life that they want to live. Many believe that what we are called to do, it's too hard. Many believe that what we are called to do as Christians is too difficult, that it's almost impossible. And you know what? It would be impossible if it weren't for the Lord our shepherd. And it would be. But we are grateful that the good shepherd is there to watch over us. We must be willing to allow him to lead us. And the shepherd is going to lead his sheep. During the summer months, a shepherd will lead his sheep all over the countryside, and they will find new pastures, they will find new land, but as winter approaches, they must trek back to where they started. And during this time, they are entirely alone with their shepherd. Those sheep are going to entirely look to their shepherd and rely solely upon him. And so as David is writing this, we can only think that he must be reminiscing on the times when he had to do this, when he knew that he was the only one out there who was caring for his sheep. He knew firsthand all of the difficulties that the sheep will face whenever they're trekking back towards their homeland. There are going to be times in our lives when we walk through what seems to be that valley of death. There will be times when we are passing through the seemingly impossible, and death and disease and darkness and all of these evil and horrible things are surrounding us, and it seems like we can't get through and there's no way that we can press on in this life. But I think it's very important for us to notice the word through in this phrase here. It doesn't say that we're going to die there. It doesn't say that we're going to stop there. It doesn't say we won't ever leave there, but rather it says through, giving us the impression that we're going to come out on the other side, that we don't have to fear what's going to come our way because our shepherd is watching over us. What did Jesus tell his apostles there at the end of that great commission in Matthew 28 and verse 20? He said, lo, I am what? I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. It doesn't matter what comes our way. The good shepherd is going to protect us, and we don't have to fear any evil. A shepherd always has some sort of instrument. He always has some sort of rod with him to protect himself. And a staff, that rod, it was something in which the shepherd would take great pride in. Keller said this, he said, each shepherd boy, from the first time he starts to tend his father's flock, takes special pride in the selection of a rod and staff exactly suited to his own size and his own strength. After he completes it, the shepherd boy then spends hours practicing with his club, learning how to throw it with amazing speed and amazing accuracy, and it becomes his main weapon of defense for both himself and his sheep. That rod would be used to guide the sheep, to help the sheep know where they need to go, but it would also be used as a disciplinary tool as well. I think about the scriptures being God's rod today, how they are an extension of his mind for us, and his word is going to guide us. Psalm 119 and 105, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. And so I think about our good shepherd and how he's going to be with us, how he will lead us, he will guide us, he will protect us, but how we also must be willing to follow him if we want to know where we need to go. And the number 3, the last lesson I want to point out is this. In God's fold, there is also communion. In God's fold, there is communion. Read with me the last 2 verses of this psalm. You prepare the table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Oftentimes a high plateau is referred to by shepherds as tables or as a tableland. And the shepherd will oftentimes go ahead of his flock. He will make sure that there is no poisonous plants, no poisonous shrubbery for those sheep to feed on as they go through there. And if a shepherd is not careful, the sheep will often eat something that's harmful to them, and sometimes it will kill the sheep. And so the table, or rather the shepherd in a sense, goes before the sheep and he prepares a table for those sheep. Oftentimes we as humans, we have the mindset of trying everything that comes our way. If it's new or if it's different, we almost always have to just dabble in it and try it and see what it is. And we do this even knowing that some of the things that come our way are dangerous. Our shepherd goes before us. He prepares the way for us, and yet sometimes we still stop along the way to try different things out. He doesn't want us to fall. Our shepherd does not want us to fail, but the choice is up to us. The shepherd has prepared the way, but we must be willing to follow him. The summertime, those summer months that we talked about a few moments ago, it's often the time that shepherds will refer to as fly time. And there are all kinds of flies that will bother the sheep: bot flies, heel flies, nose flies, deer flies, all kinds of flies, whatever flies you can think of. And those are just to name a few. But some of those parasites, they are very harmful to the sheep. The flies will land all in the sheep's wool, and they will lay their eggs there, and then they will fly off, and you can only imagine what happens after all of that happens. But to prevent this, a shepherd will apply an ointment. He will take an oil. He'll rub it all over the sheep to help prevent all of those flies from doing what it is that they do. But before the antidote is applied, the sheep's behavior is very aggressive. It's very irritable. But once that shepherd applies that ointment, applies that oil, the sheep immediately becomes calm. It immediately knows what it must do, and immediately sees the shepherd and knows that he's going to take care of him. Oftentimes we need help from our shepherd. There are daily dilemmas and situations that trouble us, that get us down, that get us discouraged in this life, and oftentimes it happens on more than one occasion. But we need help from our shepherd over and over again. I think about 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. Peter there says, "Casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you." Our cup runs over, not only because of the plethora of blessings that we receive, but because God is always watching over us, because God is always taking care of us, and that in and of itself is a blessing as well. He will always be with us, but we must be willing to follow him. That word follow there towards the end of that verse, it doesn't mean to just tag along. Rather, it's a word that gives the impression of being pursued, of being overtaken, of chasing. And the impression given there is that goodness and mercy and all those blessings of the Lord, they're going to pursue you and overtake you, but only if we remain faithful all the days of our lives. Don't you want to be able to have that constant fellowship with our shepherd? There was an unknown author that summed up Psalm 23. I think it's very fitting. It's a very fitting way to end this class. He said this. He said, "The Lord is my shepherd." That's relationship. "I shall not want." That's supply. "He makes me to lie down in green pastures." That's rest. "He leads me beside the still waters." That's refreshment. "He restores my soul." That's healing. "He leads me in the paths of righteousness." That's guidance. "For his name's sake." That's purpose. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." That's testing. "I will fear no evil." That's protection. "For thou art with me." That's faithfulness. "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." That's discipline. "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies." That's hope. "Thou anointest my head with oil." That's consecration. "My cup runs over." That's abundance. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." That's blessing. "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord." That's security. Forever. That's eternity. The 23rd Psalm very vividly compares Jesus Christ to our shepherd and us as his sheep. And in the three things that we talked about this morning, in God's fold there is provision, in God's fold there is guidance, and in God's fold there is also communion. Someone once wrote this about the